The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
All right, everyone, go and get started with our second session. I'll tell you a little more at the end, but we'll have our lunch period right after this, give you the options of Macaulay's or the Student Union, but we'll talk about more at the end. Right now, we have Dr. Ashley Riley Souza, who is an associate professor in the history department, also the director of graduate studies in the department, newly freshly minted, loving every second of it. Does a great job. She is an expert in the American West and borderlands, and also in Native American history is what she's going to talk about today. Certainly some subject that very much so fits with the new standards that have come out in a lot of different areas, but also I think you'll find has a lot of parallels to other areas and subjects that we can teach. So if you give her your attention, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Polk. Well, that's really heartening to hear that there are new standards that are pushing for a greater inclusion of Native American history into the curriculum. And that's kind of one of the reasons why when Dr. Polk asked me to be here this weekend, that I thought that this would be a really great opportunity to think about how we might work Native American history into sort of the broader narrative of American history in ways that it doesn't seem like it's an add-on, right? A few years ago, I was asked to review a book called Why You Can't Teach United States History Without American Indians. And it was a book that was intended for college-level teachers, but also equally applicable, I think, to middle and high school teachers, about how do we teach Native American history in a way that shows how integral it is to the overall picture of United States history. And came up with a ton of really great suggestions. And in fact, I was reading it to do the review at the same time that I was at the Advanced Placement U.S. History reading in Louisville, Kentucky a few years ago. And as I was sitting at the table reading it, like just teacher after teacher after teacher came up to me and said, I need that book, right? So there was clearly a lot of interest in figuring out how do we weave these stories in. So I thought today, for this presentation, a good strategy would be to start with maybe a little bit more of a local story for us here in Tennessee and connect it to the broader national economic, political, cultural, and social trends that would have characterized this period, the early 19th century in United States history. So Cherokee removal is both a national and a profoundly local story. It's going to take us from the floor of the United States Senate to the Cherokee farmsteads and cabins of North Georgia and East Tennessee, to the internment camps of Tennessee and Alabama, right through Middle Tennessee, right through Murfreesboro, and on to Indian Territory. I regret that I don't have a bigger screen to show you here, but this is a map that shows the major routes that the Cherokees took on the Trail of Tears. So Murfreesboro, unfortunately, is not on this map, but Nashville is on the red route. I don't know if you can see it right there, so we would just be a little bit southeast of that. So a good local connection, right, to local history for students. It reflects major political and economic trends in the history of 19th century America, and also the major political, economic, and cultural changes for the Cherokee Nation in that same period. It has its roots in the cotton boom and the expansion of slavery in the South, and in the shift from government by clan and community at the town level among Cherokees to a formal system of representative government defined by a written constitution for the Cherokee Nation. It reflects the Cherokee Nation's extraordinary commitment to preserving and persevering in their eastern homelands, which included North Georgia, northern Alabama, western North Carolina, and eastern Tennessee. At the same time, it revealed growing factionalism within the Cherokee Nation. It intensified that factionalism that would almost end up completely ripping the nation apart. So to get to the root of our story, it really begins in 1793. When, as I like to always tell my students, probably the most important invention in American history was invented.
Cotton gin?
Cotton gin. See, when I used to teach in California, nobody knew cotton gin, right? But in Tennessee, everybody knows it's the cotton gin. So when Eli Whitney gets credit for inventing the cotton gin in the 1790s, it causes an absolute explosion in cotton production in the United States. Between 1820 and 1830, in the middle of this boom, US cotton production doubles. By 1825, the United States is the world leader in cotton production, producing more cotton than any other nation. And along with this expansion of the growth of cotton in the United States, it comes along with an expansion in the spread of slavery. So if you can imagine a map of the United States in which cotton is growing, and you can imagine sort of like cotton overtaking the southeastern United States, every plantation that produces cotton needs a workforce to work it, and along with it comes the spread of slavery, particularly the relocation, the forced relocation of slaves from states like Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, into what we would say, I think, is the Deep South, right? The cotton-producing states. You need slavery in the early 19th century to produce cotton profitably, right? It's miserable labor. You need cheap labor to turn a profit. Right, cotton's one of those big commodities that requires mass production, right? But you also need land, right? And land, like if you think back as early as the very beginnings of the Jamestown colony, land is always that brick wall that Americans, whether in the colonial period or in the early national period, keep running up against, right? That the growth of the population seems to always outstrip the availability of land. And it's no different in the early 19th century. So economic opportunity means cotton, increasingly in the early 19th century. By 1830, when South Carolina Senator James Henry Hammond declares cotton as king, cotton has more or less come to completely dominate, or is in the process of about to be dominating. How's that for articulate? Is in the process of starting to dominate the entire American economy, right? From the actual cotton plantations of the South to the textile mills of the North to the shipping industry of the Middle Atlantic states to the finance sector and insurance sector of New York. Every part of the country is becoming enmeshed in this cotton-producing economy, so it dominates the United States. As African-American slavery becomes so critical to, even in industries where slaves are not employed. So think of the textile mills of New England, right? Textile mills in New England are still dependent completely upon slave labor in the South. And so with the entire national economy sort of coming to be so completely dependent on the product of slave labor, it's not surprising that the United States really almost as a whole, especially in the Southeast where cotton is produced, but as a whole, is becoming a society increasingly in which white comes to be synonymous with freedom and black comes to be synonymous with slavery. So during the Revolutionary era, for example, we know that a lot of enslaved people in the southern colonies and then ultimately the southern states come to use the Revolutionary War as an opportunity to stake claims for freedom. We know that in the Northeast, in places like Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut, free black people use the Revolution as an opportunity to stake a claim for greater rights and inclusion. As the 19th century wears on, as cotton becomes king, those opportunities for inclusion for free black people and for freedom for enslaved black people dwindle and wither. As Americans legally come to define freedom as associated with whiteness and enslavement as associated with blackness. Slaveholding states begin passing legislation that restricts any opportunities for freedom for African Americans, but also even among like the free black communities in these states, freedom becomes highly circumscribed. Tiny privileges within slavery become regulated and prohibited. So a good example of this would be in 1820 when South Carolina passed a law to forbid the manumission of slaves, right? Now, this is ironic because, of course, Charleston had a large free black population at the time, but the idea was we really want to keep a tight rein on this idea that black means slave and white means free. The presence of free black people challenges that, right? And those people need to be need to not exist or exist to the minimum extent possible in South Carolina. So in places like South Carolina, Virginia had a law on the books, I think that dated back to the colonial era on this topic. If you want to manumit your slave, you go right ahead as long as you manumit them outside of this state, right? Things like restricting the ability, or restricting the ability of enslaved people to learn to read or write. It becomes a crime to teach an enslaved person to read or write. Things like the ability to move between plantations, right? Stricter pass systems are instituted. This tighter grip of control over enslaved people and the tighter regulation of the actions of both white and black people in terms of how enslaved people could be treated has its roots in a long-standing paranoia that slaveholding colonists back in the colonial period and then Americans in the early national period, paranoia that they held about possible cooperation and possible cooperation and collaboration between Native Americans and enslaved Africans and African Americans, right? Now this is sort of hugely ironic, right? Because we know sort of the first servant rebellion in British colonial North America is Bacon's Rebellion, and Indians caught the brunt of Bacon's Rebellion. They were in no way allying themselves, with slaves, enslaved Africans, white indentured servants, or anyone else, right? They caught the brunt of the violence from the Servant Rebellion. But there is like a long-standing fear that slaves could escape and sort of meld in to Indian communities, or even worse, that Indians might cooperate with enslaved people to sort of overthrow slavery or challenge slavery. So as cotton production and slavery and a very, very restrictive form of slavery expand into the American Southeast, the presence of so many Native Americans in the midst of this cotton plantation-based economy that, again, is a priority in every corner of the United States by this point in time, is a matter of serious concern, not only for slave owners, but for anybody who has a stake in this cotton economy. I'll add to that, just as an aside, that the worry about cooperation or collaboration between enslaved people and Native Americans is problematic in the minds of slave owners and other whites, partly because, yes, it could present a violent overthrow of the slave regime. It could, shenanigans could be a consequence, but also because of the opportunity that it presented to people of African descent to sort of biologically, genetically meld into Indian populations, and then you wouldn't know who was black. Right? And then how do you uphold a slave regime in which legally slaves inherit the status of their mother when in theory, what if there's an Indian mother of a black child? Right?
So are they looking to like Latin America particularly as like where there was much more mixing as like a fear, where that fear was coming from? Like, oh, we don't want to end up where society is that stratified. Or that many options in society. So like the racial ideology that that is kind of coalescing in the United States in this period of time is like the Anglophone world, like the English-speaking world kind of shares in a roughly common understanding of race, racial mixing, the status of the races in the hierarchy of mankind. So yeah, they look to Latin America. I'm not sure specifically in the 1830s, but I know that certainly by the 1840s, they're looking to Latin America, they're looking to Mexico and being like, this mestizo thing is like worse than if they were just Indians, right? So this racial ideology starts to take shape that race mixing produces the worst outcome, right? That it's not just like a roll of the dice in terms of the characteristics that the children of a mixed relationship could have. It was believed that racial mixing would kind of distill the worst traits of either race, which of course, especially as the Victorian era wears on, we're carefully cataloging, right? And then you would end up with a society of mixed people who exemplified like the worst characteristics of both races. So in the case of, say, the United States by the 1840s looking at Mexico with an eye toward conquering it, they're like savage like Indians, right? They're untrustworthy, savage, bloodthirsty, but they're also part European, so they're smart enough to really do something about it. right? So the Mexicans were like this huge threat because they kind of embodied both the savagery and the sophistication that made, in the minds of Americans, a very terrifying combination. So in Virginia, for example, so for those of you who are familiar with the story of Anthony Johnson, the African servant who attained freedom in colonial Virginia, went on to become a major property owner, a gentleman property owner in his own right, employed his own white indentured servants, held his own slaves, was treated sort of as a wealthy planter would expect to be treated. You guys familiar with the Anthony Johnson story? So the Johnson family is a good example of that phenomenon. So when the strictures surrounding slavery, or the restrictions surrounding slavery sort of tighten in colonial Virginia, the Johnson family kind of moves all around. They move to Delaware, they move to Maryland. They're trying anything that they can to kind of get out from underneath this system, which is increasingly separating society into black and slave and free and white. And the Johnson family ends up sort of falling in with a Nanticoke Indian community. And whereas the Johnson family sort of falls out of the colonial records in colonial Virginia, their name endures in Nanticoke communities. The Johnson name is a very prominent Nanticoke name. One sort of important Nanticoke town in Delaware is actually called Angola, right, which is believed to be a reference to Anthony Johnson's birthplace. So that's the other thing that really terrifies slave owners. Meanwhile, since the 1790s, the Cherokees have been deeply impacted by a United States Indian policy that has emphasized the need to civilize Native Americans. The idea was, Native Americans control a lot of land, and the reason that they control a lot of land is because Indian men hunt. And of course, in the English, like, common understanding of hunting, that's a leisure activity reserved for gentlemen, right? Hunting is not a subsistence activity that ought to be available to anybody. This is like a gentleman's act. You guys have seen Downton Abbey, right? Like, this is a gentleman's, or one of my favorites, Gosford Park, right, where you have like the hunting party that goes out. That's a gentleman's activity. Indians ought not to be doing it. So what we need to do is we need to convince Indian men to take up farming. And if we can get them to take up farming, then all that land that they kind of held as game reserves can then be sold to white settlers who need it, right? So the United States Department of War sends Indian agents into the field throughout the Southeast who attempt to get Indian men to pick up agriculture. It's terribly unsuccessful in the sense that in every eastern woodlands Indian society I can think of, agriculture is a woman's job, right? And not only is it that men don't want to do women's work, but women are like, no, you're not gonna come in here and mess up my fields. You don't know what you're doing. You are not gonna farm for this community. Get the hell out of my field, right? So there is great resistance to the idea of men taking over agriculture. But there is a great acceptance, at least among Native women, of saying, oh, you want to send plows and spinning wheels and like new seeds and fertilizers and implements? Bring it on, right? So the Cherokee Nation, among other Southeastern Indian nations, like take in this huge influx of support from the United States federal government. They just use it in a way that the government doesn't want them to use it, right? Women are like, my plow, right? Like, keep the men out of the field. They don't know what they're doing. So in the midst of all this sort of civilization, Indian policy, Northern missionaries begin coming down to the Cherokee Nation and other Southeastern nations, and don't really make a lot of headway in converting Indians to Christianity, but missionaries and Indian agents become like those intermediaries between like Indian folks who are like, look, we have interests that we want to pursue. We have a relationship that we want to develop with the federal government to make sure that our interests are accounted for, and you guys are going to help us, right? You're going to be the intermediaries between political leadership at the town level among Indian communities and then the United States federal government. Between the impact of the civilization policy, the impact of the arrival of missionaries, and a third factor, which is the intermarriage between Native women and Scots and Scots-Irish traders who like infiltrate the Southeast conducting trade. There is a growing group of young people in the Cherokee Nation coming of age in the early 19th century who are the product of two worlds, right? They have white fathers, white English-speaking fathers. They have Cherokee mothers, and they kind of straddle those two worlds. And in the way that your dad wants to set you up for success, right, they inherit their father's property, they inherit their father's wealth, and they're able, with the influence of the civilization program, the influence of missionaries, and this sort of nest egg and influence of their fathers, to set themselves up as a sort of an economic and political elite within the Cherokee Nation. They're educated in New England schools by missionaries. They are literate, educated, accustomed to living in a sort of more affluent style in the American fashion. And as the civilization program encourages men to take up farming, the sons of these traders and Cherokee women find a compromise that works really well for them. Farming is women's work, we don't want to do it. But there are a lot of demands on us, both family demands but also government demands, to live in a fashion that is consistent with white civilization. So if we set ourselves up like the white society that we see around us, what that means is the ideal is I am a plantation owner, I live in a nice plantation house with a lot of acreage, and African slaves do the work for me, right? So this sort of slave-owning elite takes shape in the Cherokee Nation in the early decades of the 19th century. And by 1827, the Cherokee Nation starts rethinking, all right, there's a lot of pressure on us from outside. White settlers want our land. The US government is pressuring us to become civilized and live this lifestyle that's not necessarily consistent with Cherokee traditions. What we need to do is we need to figure out a way that we can protect our interests, right? I mean, we're wealthy elite landowners, but certainly, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that our lands are protected from white settlers who might want to take it. So we need to protect our interests, but sort of overall the interests of the Cherokee people, which are leave us alone. We don't want to become Christian. We don't want men to become farmers. Women don't want to give up their own farms, right? We want to continue kind of living undisturbed as our own people. So in a weird turn of events, the Cherokees decide that the best way to pursue this independence, this ongoing sort of commitment to we kind of run our own affairs, is to restructure their governments, which kind of on the town level had been locally governed through the structures of kinship, the clan system. Restructure all of that to more closely align with the United States government. Right? So step one is a written constitution that is modeled on the United States Constitution. It defines an executive, the principal chief. It defines a legislature, similar to our Congress, the tribal council, the national council, rather. And it defines a judiciary, a court system, right? So there are Cherokee police who can arrest criminals who then stand trial in the court system. There is a legislature that passes laws that are written down. There is a constitution that defines the responsibilities and rights of Cherokee citizens. This also develops a social and cultural divide within the Cherokee Nation, right? As prominent leaders like the principal chief, John Ross, who live a lifestyle that is very alien to the vast majority of Cherokee people who continue women farming, men hunting. Justice and order is kept at the local level by the clans. But the one thing that I want to caution you guys against is imagining that this is going to become a showdown between assimilated, mixed blood, like slave-owning elites and sort of like more traditional, like the common people, right, who don't necessarily want to assimilate. Because that is way too oversimplified, as we'll see in a minute. Meanwhile, back in Georgia, Georgia has been living with the expectation that the United States is going to make good on an agreement that it promised Georgia in 1802. That if Georgia would give up all of its claims to this huge swath of Western land, that the United States would extinguish Indian title to all lands within Georgia that Indians still claimed, right? So different Native nations had signed treaties with the United States that said, you are guaranteed possession and enjoyment of this land right there in Georgia for ever and ever, right? And behind their backs, the United States was promising Georgia, don't worry, we'll take care of this problem. You will not have to put up with the problem of Indians controlling land within the borders that you claim for your state. So this map right here shows Georgia's very, very aspirational Western claims back in the day. So that's what the United States was trying to get, like, Georgia, let it go. And Georgia was like, okay, if. And the United States was like, fine, we'll deal with it. Well, the population pressure doesn't become such in Georgia that it's a real problem until we have the expansion of cotton, right? Until we have a huge pressure on the Western territories and into, across the trans-Appalachian Southwest, we'll call it. This is simmering. Georgia wants the title extinguished. The United States is dragging its feet, but this all comes to a head in 1829. In 1829, gold is discovered on the Chestatee River, and a gold rush ensues in which the lands of the Cherokee Nation are overrun by gold prospectors. Now keep in mind that Georgia already wants control of Cherokee territory. It already wants the Cherokee Nation not to be in charge of all the territory that it claims within the state of Georgia. And the gold rush becomes not the reason for Georgia to start taking action, but it becomes sort of like the spark that lights the powder keg. This gold rush then gives Georgia kind of like the momentum, the oomph, to then say, all right, this Indian title problem goes away now. So in 1829, Georgia, through the Georgia State Legislature, passes a series of laws that extend the jurisdiction of the authority of the state of Georgia into the Cherokee territory, into the Cherokee Nation. Now, of course, treaties, along with the United States Constitution, constitute the supreme law of the land in the United States. Nothing is more important than a treaty except for the U.S. Constitution. So no state law, nothing below the Constitution should supersede a treaty. So when Georgia just passes these laws abolishing the Cherokee Nation, abolishing the Cherokee government, basically declaring Cherokee everything to be illegal, that is patently unconstitutional. It's in violation of every single treaty the United States has ever signed with the Cherokee Nation. This is ridiculous, or it should be ridiculous. But by 1829, Andrew Jackson is the president of the United States. And Indian policy is part of like the executive cabinet, right? At least in this case, it's the War Department. So Andrew Jackson, because he is the executive, he's the chief executive of the United States, he has sort of a lot of push, a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? It's got a lot of juice in terms of crafting Indian policy and influencing Indian policy. He's also like a pretty popular guy. He's a popular president. There's never going to be a time in 19th century American history where the message of, we're going to get more land for you, we're going to make more land available to you, is ever going to be unpopular. Now, there are definitely critics of Jackson's proposed Indian policy, which is the wholesale removal of Native Americans out of all American territory east of the Mississippi River and relocating them to Indian territory west of the Mississippi River. There are critics. Abolitionists criticize it, right? Both on humanitarian grounds from the perspective of like, this sucks for Indians, but also on the grounds that opening up all that land is going to open it up to what? Slavery, right? The expansion of slavery. Northern missionaries who are at work in these Indian nations oppose it, right? Like, hey, we're just trying to get these folks on their feet. You can't just be willy-nilly relocating them, right? Obviously, the Cherokees and other Indian nations oppose this removal policy, but it's very popular nonetheless, and Congress passes and Andrew Jackson signs into law the Indian Removal Act in 1830. Now, the Indian Removal Act is interesting because it doesn't actually remove anybody. The Indian Removal Act simply authorizes the president to appoint commissioners to go into the field and negotiate treaties of removal with Indian people, or with Indian nations. Theoretically, nobody should be force removed, right? This should be completely voluntary. It should be a product of careful, thoughtful negotiations. But of course, in the context of what's happening in Georgia, where Georgia has declared the Cherokee Nation to be illegal, there is a campaign of harassment that the state initiates against the Cherokees through its law enforcement. They start making demands that any white people who go into, the Cherokee Nation doesn't exist after 1829, according to the state of Georgia. But if you go into the territory that used to be the Cherokee Nation, you have to have a passport that the state issues to you. The state issues passports to every gold miner, but refuses to issue passports to missionaries who are among the Cherokee's staunchest white allies. By 1831, the Cherokee government has relocated to Red Clay on the Tennessee side of the border. And they are doing their best to attempt to fight back. And I'm sorry, I meant to show you that slide earlier. They're doing their best to fight back. And the principal chief, John Ross, is like spending all of his time in Washington, D.C., along with other Cherokee like, sort of political elites, attempting to lobby Congress, attempting to gain an audience with the president. And they're trying and they're failing. So finally in 1831, the Cherokee Nation pursues sort of its last recourse. And that is it files a suit against the state of Georgia in the Supreme Court of the United States. So in 1831, in the Supreme Court case, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the Cherokee Nation says, look, Georgia's got to stop all this nonsense because this is a violation of our treaty rights. It's a violation of our sovereignty. And it's unconstitutional, right? Georgia cannot be allowed to trample federal law and treaty law. And the Supreme Court simply declines to hear the case. And in stating his reasons for declining, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Marshall, who actually is pretty sympathetic to the Cherokees, but not so sympathetic that he's willing to establish a precedent in the Supreme Court that Indian nations are independent foreign nations. He says we can't hear this case. Because if the Cherokee Nation was an independent foreign country, yes, we could hear the case because our Constitution outlines that foreign nations may sue the United States government or sue individual states through the Supreme Court. That would be okay. But the Cherokee Nation, he declares, is not an independent foreign country. It is, in his words, a domestic dependent nation. So the case can't be heard at the Supreme Court. The domestic dependent nation thing then becomes, in some ways, a double-edged sword for the United States, right? So the Supreme Court has established, all right, so they're not independent foreign countries. They can't always in every way act independently from the United States government. However, if you want to know why there can be Indian casinos within states that forbid casino gambling, this is why. Because the Supreme Court has said, you guys are kind of in nations with a certain amount of sovereignty, right? Not foreign countries, but domestic dependent nations, right? You're dependent on the foreign government, but you're not dependent or intertwined with state governments. So if the state says no gambling allowed, that doesn't matter to you. The state says pay taxes, that doesn't matter to you. That's why cheap cigarettes on Indian reservations. So if the state passes laws, those are not relevant to the Indian nations that exist within the borders of any particular state. So they're domestic and dependent at the federal level, but not at the state level. Absolute chaos in the Cherokee Nation. In 1832, one of the missionary allies of the Cherokee Nation, a missionary by the name of Samuel Worcester, I brought this one up to give you guys a perspective on how cotton spreads into the United States, or into the Southeast. So each one of those black dots represents 2,000 bales of cotton. And I wanted you to see where that cotton production is concentrated. So in the Mississippi Delta and in the Black Belt of Alabama. Those are the two areas of greatest concentration. But you can see that there are swaths of sort of more diffuse cotton production everywhere, right, in every southeastern state. And then I wanted you to see how it overlaps with the national territory, the tribal territory of the southeastern tribes. So you can see, like, you know, in 1830, the year that cotton becomes king, how urgent it is to make these lands available for cotton production. The creeks have to go, right? The Cherokees have to go, the Chickasaws have to go, the Seminoles have to go, the Choctaws have to go. Especially, so the Mississippi Delta is really the most important cotton-producing region in the United States, so the Chickasaws and the Choctaws especially have to go. So in 1832, Samuel Worcester enters into the Cherokee Nation without a pass. He does not get a passport from the state of Georgia because he shouldn't have to. But he's arrested for it. He's arrested for illegally being inside the Cherokee Nation, which doesn't exist anymore. The part of Georgia that used to be the Cherokee Nation, but now it doesn't exist anymore. He appeals, and his appeal reaches the Supreme Court, which does decide to hear this case because Samuel Worcester is an American citizen. So in 1832, John Marshall, Chief Justice, again, remember I said he was sympathetic to the Cherokees' cause. He signs the majority, or he writes the majority opinion in which he says, yes, the laws of Georgia do not apply here, right? Georgia has no right to force Samuel Worcester or anybody else to provide a passport before entering into the Cherokee Nation because Georgia does not have the authority to abolish the Cherokee Nation. It doesn't have the authority to police the Cherokee Nation's borders, et cetera, right? This is the point in which Andrew Jackson reportedly, we don't know for sure, but reportedly issues his infamous statement, John Marshall has made his law, now let him enforce it. Meaning, I'm not touching this with a 10-foot pole. Georgia, you go right ahead. Do what you do.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, this seems like it could be a total like powder keg for states' rights, like the idea of like a state can overturn or go above a federal treaty, and then when we get into like abolishing slavery and like nullification and trying to secede, like this seems, if Marshall didn't pass that, it could have set a really bad precedent for southern states.
Yeah, so the states' rights issue as it pertains to slavery is so convoluted and complicated, but this is exactly consistent with Jackson and his political outlook, right, which is sort of limiting the authority of the federal government, even when it's unconstitutional, right, which he dabbles in unconstitutionality throughout his presidency. So yeah, this is one of those cases where you have Jackson, who is a Democrat, who believes in, right, like more decentralized power, right, limiting federal power, versus Marshall, who's a Federalist, right? He's an old school Federalist. So he is exactly the type of person who's like, no, wait, like the federal power supersedes all of this, right? Georgia can't just be writing its own rules. But of course, the states' rights question is so complicated when it comes to the question of slavery because on the issue of the abolition of slavery, it's the South that wants stricter federal power and the North that wants states' rights, right? The North is like, we should be able to be free states, and the South is like, no, my property should be my property everywhere. Massachusetts should not have the right to declare itself to be a free state and allow our property to go there and suddenly become human beings, right, legally. So yeah, it's a really convoluted question. Yeah, I mean, the slave-owning states are like demanding that the federal government extend, like think of like the Dred Scott decision, right? Like extend the right to slavery everywhere. Yeah. Now, I mean, to be controversial, but also fair, the Constitution does protect that, right? The Constitution protects you in your right to your property. And so in defining African Americans as property and not human beings under the law, the various states were able to make that work. But that, that's, some would say that was the original problem with our Constitution, right? All right, so in yes?
It seems to me you can't address the, Jackson didn't put into the Indian problem without addressing his total anti-Indian approach to life. My ancestors were in South Georgia, and after Jackson came down and wiped out at the Battle of, I can't remember the name of it now, they're in southern Alabama.
Horseshoe Bend, yeah.
Horseshoe Bend, and killed so many. My ancestors came over and took land. So
Yeah, so Jackson, I mean, one of the reasons why Jackson is so popular and is able to make such a political career for himself in this period of time is precisely because he has this long history of being an Indian fighter. And one of the real painful ironies for the Cherokee Nation is that John Ross, the principal chief, had been fighting with Jackson, not fighting against Jackson, but fighting with Jackson against the Creek resistance at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, right? So apparently being Andrew Jackson's ally and fighting Indians gets you nothing. if you're an Indian, because then Jackson came after the Cherokees anyway. So Jackson, when I was interviewed for the job here at Middle Tennessee State University during my teaching demonstration, one of the members of the committee who was interviewing me sort of tried to ask you, like, gently ask you questions that kind of see how deft you are or how adroit you are on your feet. So one of the members of the committee asked me directly, was Andrew Jackson a villain? And I was like, oh God, like this is a loaded question in Tennessee, right? Like this could go either way. But Jackson, like, really he's like the poster child for this kind of anti-Indian sentiment, for the sort of rapacious greed for land, for hardline stances about slavery and its expansion. But he was really popular. He didn't invent this stuff, right? So I think I tried to like answer the question by like mincing every word possible. But I think my answer to the question, was Andrew Jackson a villain, was like, yes, this stuff is horrible. It was understood as horrible by a lot of people, including the Supreme Court, back in his day. But at the same time, if Jackson didn't do it, somebody else would have, because this was so politically popular, right? This was such a, think about all the times in American history where somebody said, British North American colonists or Americans, you can't have access to this land because Indians live on it. Well, in 1763, it fomented a revolution in which we overthrew the imperial power that restricted us from having the land, right? Because we didn't like the proclamation line of 1763. To take it all the way back to Bacon's rebellion, right? Like, never ever tell a British North American colonist that they can't have land. Also, don't ever tell a 19th century American they can't have land, right? Because that is going to end in bloodshed and riot. And maybe more kindly, you being voted out of office. So if it hadn't have been Jackson, somebody would have put some kind of spin on Indian removal, because it was just so popular. You can't tell Americans in the 19th century that they can't have land. In the midst of all this, the United States government starts sending agents into the Cherokee Territory to negotiate treaties of removal. And John Ross is trying, the principal chief, he's trying to resist removal, forestall it, get better terms of removal. He's trying everything he can to make the most palatable outcome for the Cherokee Nation. Ideally, it's not having to move. Worst case scenario, it's getting a ton of money, preferential removal conditions, better territory in Indian Territory, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, as Ross is not making any kind of meaningful progress in his negotiations with the federal government, the United States, this is Principal Chief John Ross, in his younger years. So the United States government reaches out to a sort of the opposition, the folks within the Cherokee Nation who are most opposed to Ross, and who see removal and the idea of signing their own treaty with the United States authorizing Cherokee removal, not so much as an opportunity for personal gain, but as an opportunity to say, look, if the United States government is not going to rein in Georgia, and presumably any other state that tries to engage in these shenanigans, because Tennessee is probably next, Alabama's after that, right? Like, this is going to happen again and again. Sets a bad precedent. Then what we really need to do is be thinking about protecting our sovereignty. Would we rather be third-class Georgians on the land that we've always lived on, or would we rather be first-class Cherokees living somewhere else, right? And they decided it's better to live as first-class Cherokees somewhere else. And so in 1835, they, at the ancient Cherokee capital of New Echota, signed a treaty of removal with the United States government. In exchange for $5 million, the Cherokees would relocate to Indian Territory. Not a very good deal. So these folks represented in these portraits are Elias Boudneau, who is the editor of the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper. In the middle is Stand Watie, who was a prominent Cherokee planter and slave owner, ultimately becomes the last Confederate general to surrender at the end of the Civil War. And on this end is Major Ridge, another prominent planter, who interestingly did not speak English and was not literate. And when he signed the Treaty of New Echota, he had to mark it with an X because he couldn't sign his own name, right? So this is when I say don't try to separate this out into the traditional Cherokees versus the assimilated Cherokees. That was not at all how it worked. You could have a slave-owning gentleman wearing that outfit who didn't speak a word of English, right? Or you could have John Ross, who was very much sort of a representative of traditional people, who was himself mostly Scottish, and who was in every way a Southern gentleman, right? So to cut to the chase, this completely throws the Cherokee Nation into chaos, because now they're going to be forced to be removed. They're going to be rounded up at bayonet point, interned in detention camps, force marched halfway across the continent. About 4,000 Cherokees, about a quarter of the Cherokee Nation's total population dies during the forced removal, both in the detention camps and on the Trail of Tears, to say nothing of the deaths from starvation, exposure, and deprivation that occur after they're relocated into Indian Territory, before they have crops in the ground, before they have adequate supplies, before they have homes built. There is no welcome wagon being rolled out in Indian Territory to accommodate the Cherokees as they arrive, beginning in 1838, 1839. But it also provokes a civil war, because this Cherokee Constitution very clearly stipulates that it is a capital crime to sign any treaty or make any sale of Cherokee land without proper authorization of the Cherokee National Government. So when Major Ridge, when he signed the Treaty of New Echota, he was reported to have said in Cherokee, well, I've just signed my death warrant, right? So these guys knew that the penalty was very likely to be not just like capital punishment, but like vigilante execution, right? And that is what happens. Major Ridge is executed. Elias Boudinot is executed. Stan Wadey, the guy in the center, he avoids the vigilante justice, the vigilante squad that comes for him. But yeah, I mean, you can see how the sort of tit for tat, like you got me, my family's gonna retaliate against you, in a society in which clan justice had been the traditional practice, would easily get out of hand. So this is to say nothing of the many dozens or more Cherokees who were killed in this sort of retaliatory vigilante violence after removal to the Indian Territory. This solves, though, for the United States, and most particularly more particularly to the slave-owning states, and especially for Georgia, a lot of problems, right? It frees up, again, we'll backtrack to my maps. Remember, it frees up that prime cotton-producing land for production, but it also helps to maybe kind of settle the question or ease the question of what do you do with Indians in a society in which to be black means to be enslaved and to be white means to be free. They certainly aren't white, right? Not by any stretch of the imagination in the Southeast at the time. Certainly not white. Do you want, as a plantation owner or as the leader of a slave society, do you want a group of people, thousands of people in your midst who represent every day an example of, well, see, you can be not white, but also free? Is that the message that you want enslaved people to be getting? You can get out there and you can, even though you're not white, you can be free. God, no, right? That invites ideas about freedom, and maybe I can get it, and maybe I should get it. Are Cherokees, are Indians in general going to be able to vote once their nations are abolished and they're part of the state of Georgia? No. But what do we know about Americans who are told, no, you can't have citizenship? Find a group of people in the United States who's been told, you can't have citizenship, you can't vote, or you're going to have citizenship, but it's not going to be quite equal. What always happens?
They fight for it.
They fight for it, right? Every group of people who's told, nope, like you're going to be marginalized in this way or that way, it ends up being ranging from revolution to movement. There's going to be some kind of uprising against it. So you don't want that in your midst, right? So it solves, at least temporarily, a problem of race and belonging, a problem of land cotton production, right, access to the raw materials that you need, and also kind of solves the problem of can we comfortably in the Mississippi Delta, right, in those regions of the Mississippi Delta where there is one white person for every 5 enslaved people, are we now going to feel more comfortable enough to bring more slaves into the situation, right? And so the answer is, at least temporarily, yes, right? So the Cherokee Nation is the first to experience removal. The Creeks, Choctaws, Seminoles, and Chickasaws follow. And with the exception of some small holdout populations, so the Eastern Band Cherokee in North Carolina, there are Choctaws still remaining in Mississippi. Certainly the Seminoles, you're probably familiar with the famous Seminole War, right? The Seminoles were among the strongest holdouts in Florida. Other than these remnant populations, generally speaking, for the United States government, Indian removal was a huge success. And at least for another, in the case of the Cherokees, at least for another 20 couple of years, the land that was vacated by Indians who were forced to remove becomes incredibly productive. So productive that it inspires more people to want to get in on the cotton game, which inspires the United States to need more land. And then once you have Indians out of the way, once you have them across the Mississippi, then you can start setting your sights on Texas, right? So Cherokee removal finished. I feel like the last contingents of Cherokees started arriving in Indian Territory in, 1842, right? Within 3 years, we're annexing Texas, right? Which provokes another violent takeover of land that doesn't belong to the United States. So this sort of steamrolling of conquest, of territorial conquest, begins with Indian removal, and it's what makes King Cotton possible. And ultimately, the fight over whether or not we could just keep extending slavery on everywhere becomes the catalyst for the American Civil War. So that's my pitch for how you can take something that maybe you didn't think of King Cotton and Indian removal as kind of like being in the same breath. But I hope that's a good example of how you can take something that doesn't necessarily relate in a textbook to Indian removal, and then hopefully now you're like, wow, I could never tell that story without it. Here is the signatures on the Treaty of New Echota. So this is the back page of the Treaty of New Echota, and again, I wish it was a little bit bigger for you to see, but you can see where some folks have signed their names, and then other folks, there's a signature that somebody else has signed for, not signed for him, but written the name for him with an X, and the X is notated his mark, right? So when you see, that's like almost half the people on that page, this is not a fight between full blood, mixed blood, or traditional versus assimilated. This is very much, the so-called treaty party is very representative of a cross-section of Cherokee society. I wanted to also kind of show some local images. This is an aerial representation of the Fort Cass Immigration Depot. Immigration Depot is a nice way of saying detention camp. But this is where the Cherokees were held in Tennessee. There were also camps in Alabama as well. And pretty easy to locate on a larger map of Tennessee for students. Again, sort of showing the removal map again at the end of the story. And then here in Rutherford County, I guess it's technically within the city limits of Smyrna, there is a restored section of the Trail of Tears that probably would make for a lousy field trip because there are no bathrooms. But it's a really beautifully restored section of the trail, and there are, a lot of the area has been flooded because of the Percy Priest Dam, but there are still these existing sections of like crumbled foundations of houses that would have been like, we call them witness houses, houses and other buildings that the relocating Cherokees would have walked by that might have provided food or services or other kinds of help. The Cherokees did on the Trail of Tears present to a lot of people a very, very sympathetic situation, right? So even if Indian removal was sort of broadly very popular, a lot of local people witnessing the actual removal itself were very moved and offered assistance to the Cherokees.
Can you talk a little bit more about the detention centers? Because I'm not as familiar with that.
Yeah, so because the principal chief, John Ross, was so energetic in trying to forestall removal, prevent removal, like he was constantly reassuring the Cherokee people, I'm gonna fight this, like don't worry, I'm gonna fight this. And this is a subject of actually hot debate even today, how cynical John Ross was or wasn't in making promises that he maybe thought he couldn't actually follow through on. So a lot of Cherokee people are like, the chief says he's got it under control, we're just gonna stay put. So even as the United States Army is issuing orders to evacuate and like get out, like you're gonna need to move, a lot of Cherokees stayed put because they believed that their principal chief, and like John Ross, he was a lobbyist in DC, he had taken a case to the Supreme Court. Of course you were gonna have faith in him, right? But it didn't turn out that way, and so at the end, the Cherokees were kind of given a deadline, and when they didn't meet that deadline to voluntarily evacuate their homes, they were literally rounded up at gunpoint. And so there are all kinds of stories that were told by Cherokees who'd experienced the removal, who, we were just sitting down to eat dinner and soldiers busted into our home, and when my dad tried to fight, they stabbed him, and then they took my mom and my brothers and sisters and I and put us on a wagon and forced us out. We left with only what was on our backs. So yeah, a lot of stories like that. Then in the removal centers or the detention camps, concentration camps, a lot of different terms that you could use for them. One of the sort of consistent themes in American Indian policy is you set up a policy, but you don't fund it. So we've set up, yes, removal must happen, and we're gonna provide food and shelter, and we're gonna pay for the removal and stuff like that, but then we actually didn't really allocate any funds to it. Or we allocated funds and they disappeared, or we allocated funds for contracts with my buddy's company, and he took the money but didn't provide the services and supplies. So these detention camps were a lot of starvation, a lot of malnutrition, not adequate facilities to house people, so a lot of exposure and the kind of illness that you would expect and the death rate that you would expect from exposure. Also like bad sanitation, right? There aren't people really weren't getting out there and thinking, hey, we need to dig latrines to service 20,000 people. So, the kind of drinking contaminated water, those types of issues. And then of course, when you have a situation like this where you have a captive population that are confined under the complete control of guards, in this case military guards, who view the captive group as being their racial inferiors, the type of casual violence that people experienced at the hands of soldiers, everything from women and little girls being raped on up to like, hey, maybe we could kill that guy for sport. So it really ran the gamut of that kind of maltreatment. Really, really horrific stuff. And then to begin a 1,000-mile on-foot journey from that baseline, you can easily see how people would have died of everything from cholera to hopelessness during the actual walk.